Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Dr. Greg Harmeling, and this presentation is part of my capstone project with the Sexual Health Alliance. In this presentation, I'll be addressing a topic that's often overlooked and deeply misunderstood: the impact of narcissistic abuse on men, specifically how it can affect their sexuality and sexual performance in future relationships. Today, we're lifting the veil on these realities, exploring how narcissistic abuse doesn't just hurt emotionally. It can deeply impact a man's sexual identity, his ability to connect, and his confidence in future relationships. So here's a quick look at what we'll be covering in this presentation. We'll start by defining what narcissistic abuse is and how it uniquely affects men. Then we'll explore the psychological effects, the impact on sex and relationships, and finally, how healing is possible with the right support, therapeutic guidance, and personal work. So, understanding male narcissistic abuse. So when we hear about abuse in intimate relationships, the focus is often on female victims, and rightly so given the prevalence. But men can and do experience abuse, including narcissistic abuse, which is a form of emotional and psychological manipulation that can leave deep, invisible scars. Narcissistic abuse often includes gaslighting, emotional invalidation, sexual coercion, and controlling behaviors, all of which can dismantle a person's sense of self-worth and trust. For men, this type of abuse is frequently minimized or dismissed due to societal norms that expect men to be tough, dominant, in control, and not show any emotion. Many men don't even realize they've been victims of emotional or psychological abuse until long after the relationship ends. This silence is reinforced by social conditioning that discourages men from acknowledging pain or vulnerabilities, especially when it's inflicted by a romantic partner. As a result, many suffer in silence. So, prevalence of male abuse. According to the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, approximately 1 in 7 men in the United States have experienced severe physical violence by an intimate partner. But what's even more concerning is that when emotional and psychological abuse are included, particularly narcissistic tactics like gaslighting, silent treatment, guilt tripping, sexual manipulation, and constant emotional invalidation, those numbers are likely much higher but vastly underreported. Men often don't label these experiences as abuse until they begin experiencing long-term emotional consequences, such as anxiety, identity confusion, and difficulty forming or maintaining healthy relationships. Qualitative research has shown that male survivors of intimate partner violence often experience shame, minimization, and isolation, which significantly impact their mental health and relational functioning. In fact, a 2023 review published in Trauma, Violence, and Abuse highlights that men frequently face long-term consequences from emotional abuse, including disrupted trust, intimacy challenges, and psychological distress. The real danger isn't just the abuse itself. It's how quietly it works to dismantle a man's sense of self, often leaving him feeling alone, unseen, and unsure of who he is. So, defining narcissistic abuse. Understanding narcissistic abuse involves recognizing the behaviors and patterns that define it. Narcissistic abuse operates through dynamics of control, manipulation, and emotional invalidation. These relationships often begin with intense idealization, followed by devaluation and eventual discard. Over time, the victim's sense of self-worth is gradually chipped away. What makes this form of abuse particularly damaging is how subtle and persistent it is. Many victims feel confused and blame themselves. The cycle of abuse is often so emotionally chaotic that the survivor doesn't even realize how deeply affected they are until long after the relationship has ended. So, understanding narcissistic abuse. Again, narcissistic abuse is a form of emotional and psychological control used by individuals with narcissistic traits or narcissistic personality disorder. Unlike physical abuse, it's often subtle and hard to recognize. It often flies under the radar. It may look like backhanded comments, subtle digs, blaming you for things they did, constantly shifting responsibility, or rewriting past events to make you question your reality. The goal is control, slowly breaking down your confidence, independence, and sense of reality. Over time, you begin to doubt yourself, your worth, and even your sanity. What makes narcissistic abuse so damaging is how quietly it happens, chipping away at you piece by piece until you no longer recognize who you are. So here's an image of the narcissistic cycle of abuse. So the narcissistic cycle of abuse is a repetitive pattern that keeps victims emotionally entangled and psychologically destabilized. It begins with the idealization stage, where the abuser showers the victim with praise, attention, and affection. This is often called love bombing. The victim feels seen, special, even chosen. But soon the relationship shifts into the devaluation stage. Subtle criticism begins to creep in. The once loving partner becomes critical, dismissive, or emotionally distant. The victim, confused, often works harder to get back the attention they once had. This is then followed by the discard stage, where the abuser may withdraw affection entirely, ghost, stonewall, or abruptly end the relationship, leaving the victim feeling worthless and abandoned. Then comes the hoovering stage, which isn't always present. But the hoovering stage is when the abuser tries to pull that victim back into the relationship after discard. It's named after the Hoover vacuum. The abuser attempts to suck the victim back in using manipulation, guilt, charm, apologies, or promises to change. And just like that, the cycle starts again. Each time it repeats, the survivor's sense of self gets chipped away a little more. Internalizing the damage. So the emotional impact of narcissistic abuse on men can be deep and long-lasting. Because this kind of abuse often goes unrecognized by both the survivor and society, many men are left to carry the weight on their own. They may struggle with shame, anxiety, self-doubt, or depression, all of which can interfere with their ability to trust others or form healthy, intimate connections. What's especially painful is that many men don't associate these struggles to the emotional abuse they've endured. Instead, they blame themselves, seeing their pain as a personal failure, rather than what it really is, the psychological fallout of surviving a toxic relationship. The effects on self-esteem and self-worth. Narcissistic abuse targets the core of a person's identity. And for men, that often means their role as provider, protector, or sexual partner. Over time, the constant criticism and emotional invalidation erode self-worth. Survivors may develop a belief that they are not lovable, not man enough, or inherently flawed. This toxic self-perception becomes embedded, making it difficult to engage in future relationships without carrying this invisible weight. Impact on trust and intimacy. One of the most painful outcomes of narcissistic abuse is the difficulty survivors have trusting others again. Even in safe and supportive relationships, many men carry the fear of being manipulated, controlled, or rejected. Vulnerability becomes threatening instead of safe. Intimacy, both emotional and sexual, can trigger flashbacks of past abuse. As a result, survivors may either isolate themselves or form shallow, surface-level connections to avoid the risk of being hurt again. The development of anxiety and depression. Many male survivors experience heightened anxiety and depression, both during and after the abusive relationship. The chronic stress of walking on eggshells, never knowing what will trigger an outburst or silent treatment, puts the nervous system into a constant state of vigilance. Over time, this leads to fatigue, mood swings, and emotional shutdowns. And because these symptoms are often minimized or misdiagnosed in men, many suffer in silence, blaming themselves for what's essentially a trauma response. The effects on sexuality and performance. So now that we've explored the psychological toll narcissistic abuse can take on men, I'm going to turn to a topic that's often even more hidden and often more painful. How this type of abuse affects a man's sexuality and his experience of sexual performance. When trust, self-esteem, and emotional safety are compromised, it doesn't just affect how someone thinks or feels, it changes how they connect, how they show up physically, and how they experience intimacy. So let's take a closer look at how trauma can reshape the body's ability to feel safe, responsive, and desired. So performance anxiety and physiological effects. One of the most damaging effects of narcissistic abuse for male survivors is the development of sexual performance anxiety. When you're constantly criticized, manipulated, or made to feel inadequate, it becomes nearly impossible to feel safe or confident in your body, especially in moments of intimacy. This anxiety doesn't just live in the mind, it manifests physiologically. Many men experience erectile dysfunction, difficulty reaching orgasm, or a complete shutdown of desire. And when these symptoms appear, they often create a vicious cycle. The more anxiety a man feels about his performance, the more likely the symptoms are to persist. Difficulties with arousal and satisfaction. Even when sexual function remains intact, the ability to feel satisfaction often doesn't. Psychological trauma disrupts arousal, connection, and pleasure. When sex has been used as a weapon, or when vulnerability has been punished, intimacy becomes emotionally unsafe. Many survivors describe feeling disconnected during sex, physically present, but emotionally distant. For some, the weight of emotional distress completely blocks the body's natural sexual response. For others, arousal might still happen, but it feels empty or unsatisfying. The important thing to remember is that these aren't signs of weakness or brokenness. They're natural responses to trauma, not reflection of a man's worth or masculinity. So pathways to healing or recovery. So talking about the impact is essential, but it's not the end of the story. The good news is that healing from narcissistic abuse is possible. So moving forward, we'll begin to explore the different ways recovery can happen, from finding the right kind of support, to rebuilding self-esteem, to restoring your connections to your body, your boundaries, and your relationships. So importance of validation and support. The initial stage of recovery from narcissistic abuse involves accurately identifying and acknowledging the abuse. Survivors benefit most when their experiences are validated rather than minimized, challenged, or pathologized. Therapeutic validation serves as a critical foundation for healing, facilitating the restoration of self-concept and emotional safety. When men are met with empathy, compassion, and belief, it breaks the cycle of silence and self-doubt. It tells them you're not crazy, you're not weak, and you're not alone. Therapeutic interventions. So recovery from narcissistic abuse typically necessitates structured, trauma-informed therapeutic interventions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is effective in addressing maladaptive thought patterns and core negative beliefs commonly internalized by survivors, such as feeling unworthiness, perceived defectiveness, or powerlessness, while providing tools for cognitive restructuring and behavioral activation. Additionally, trauma-focused modalities, including EMDR and internal family systems, or IFS, can facilitate the integration of unresolved emotional experiences and reestablish a sense of internal safety and coherence. More than anything, therapy creates space for survivors to reconnect with who they truly are, not the version shaped by manipulation or control, but the self that existed before the abuse and still exists underneath it. Rebuilding healthy relationships and self-image. One of the most empowering stages of recovery is learning to build healthy relationships again, starting with the ones you have with yourself. This means setting clear boundaries, identifying emotional red flags, and building trust with people who respect and reciprocate. Reclaiming your sexuality is part of that healing. It's about experiencing intimacy with safety, mutuality, and authenticity. And it's about rebuilding a self-image not defined by trauma, but by truth. So in conclusion, while narcissistic abuse leaves invisible wounds, those wounds don't have to define you or become permanent scars. As we've explored, the emotional, relational, and sexual impacts are real, but so is the possibility of healing. As therapists, coaches, educators, and as a society, we must begin to recognize the lasting impact this kind of abuse has on men, not just emotionally, but sexually, relationally, and psychologically. Whether you're a survivor, a clinician, or someone simply seeking to understand more, I hope this presentation has brought greater awareness to an often overlooked experience and reminded you that healing is possible. Through validation, community, therapy, and self-reclamation, it's possible to move forward, not with shame, but with strength. Thank you for taking the time to be a part of this conversation. If this message resonated with you, feel free to share it. And most importantly, know that you're not alone. Take care of yourselves, and thanks again for watching.